was this part of the gospel, or the first reading rather, that reminded me of the first part of our big story, the Kerygma. But this part, it says in the book of Wisdom, "For you love all things that are, and loathe nothing that you have made. For what you hated you would not have fashioned. And how could a thing remain unless you willed it, or be preserved, had it not been called forth by you?" So if you recall last Christmas, we spoke about that first part of the Kerygma, our story, the story of our faith, that God has created everything out of love. Why does anything exist? Because God, in His love, created all the universe. He created the earth and all that exists on the earth. And out of love, He created us and created everything for us. And this love is not merely a sentimental kind of affection, although it is included in that. The love of God is completely self-giving. If God would have created everything out of need, it wouldn't be that way. But God has no need. He created only because out of a desire to share His life with us. Again, go back to that definition of divine love, which is to will the good of the other as other. God doesn't want, sometimes we do that, we'll do something to show our love for somebody, but there is kind of in the back of our minds this kind of ulterior motive that we might get something back. But God's love is not that way. There's one added thing, which is, how could a thing remain unless you willed it, added to the story, which is that God didn't just create everything all these years ago, thousands of years ago, but God's love continues to sustain everything that exists. If God were to cease to love, everything would disappear. But He continues to love us and to love all creation. And in that context, so let's look at the gospel. Zacchaeus, why is he behaving badly? Now, he's a Jew. He would have known that the seventh commandment, "Thou shalt not steal," yet he has made a life out of stealing, extorting, legalized extortion from his own people. But he seems to ignore the law. Now, why is that? Well, I think it's because he does not know the love of God for him. He has fallen for that deception that God is not a loving Father. That lie that God is not a loving Father. And he ignores the law. And not just know in an intellectual sense, but in the biblical sense of knowing the intimate, powerful love of God. But there's still something in Zacchaeus that knows the love of God. Perhaps because he's not fulfilled. He's been extorting people for a long time in this, because he's a chief tax collector. That means it's like the CEO of tax collectors. And he's rich. And so he has been doing this for a long time, but there's something missing perhaps in his life. And he's willing to seek after it when he hears about and he sees Jesus, such that he's willing to make a fool of himself and climb up a tree. And he goes, you know the story, but I'll talk about it on a little bit of different level. When Jesus invites himself to Zacchaeus' house, that Zacchaeus receives him into his house is symbolic of not just saying, hey, come on in to my material house, but to welcome someone into their home in those days was a very intimate thing, and it wasn't just to say hi and then leave. It was to come in and to have a meal and to welcome them into their home. So it was an intimate thing, and symbolically this is St. Augustine, it is Zacchaeus welcoming Jesus into the home of his life, into every room of his life. He's saying, I don't want you just to come into the front room and visit for a while. I want you to come in and inhabit every room of my house, the house of my life. And it's only then, when Zacchaeus does that, in that encounter of love with Jesus, that he recognizes the Father's is a good Father who loves him, and it's only then that he repents. It's that encounter with the love of God and the realization of the Father's love that he then changes his life. And sometimes we can think that if I just get a little better, then maybe I can go to church, or I can receive God's love. Then I'll be loved. I can earn that love from God. If I were just a little better, God would love me. But that's exactly the opposite of what the Bible says, of what the Scriptures say. It's receiving the love of God into our lives, and then out of love, we desire and we receive the strength to change our lives. And sometimes we can look at other people and say, well, if they would just shape up, then I would love them. Then I would go and visit them. Or then I would, then perhaps God would love them. But again, as Christians, as followers of Jesus Christ, it's how can I, when I not make that judgment about people, about their behavior, and instead, how can I show them the love of Christ, or lead them to the love of Christ, and look past that bad behavior, if you will. Let's just take a few minutes and consider in our lives, where are we in our understanding of the love of Christ, and where do we seek that love? Sometimes we can grasp after things that we think are going to fulfill us, but it's not the love of God. Are we, like the old song, are we seeking for love in all the wrong places? And the sacraments and prayer are places where we can find God's love and receive it. And what about people in our lives? Do we dismiss them because of their bad behavior? Or do we look for ways to pray for them? Look for ways to invite them to encounter and to receive the love of Jesus Christ?